this journey. So the first principle I want to talk about this morning is the idea of genre. All right? So, genre. All right. So there's a little picture there on your page of genre. You can take some notes there. And it's got three different fruits, right? A pineapple, a banana, and an apple. Does anybody remember, if they were here last time, what that picture is meant to remind us of when we talk about genre?
They're all fruits.
They're all fruits.
But they are not the same fruit. They're very different.
That's right, yes. They're all fruit, but I'm guessing none of you kind of grab a pineapple and just start biting into it like an apple, right? You've got to eat them differently. And in the same way, all of the Bible's literature, it's all fruit, but it's not all the same type of fruit, right? So that's what that drawing reminds us of, right? That every genre in the Bible is a different type of genre and needs to be eaten or read a slightly different way. So we can think about different types of genres, right? So what are a couple of different genres that we find in kind of the Bible? Apocalyptic. Oh man, you go for a big one. All right. Apocalyptic. That's like the book of Revelation, back half of Daniel, some of Ezekiel. So this is where it's kind of like visions, often futurish oriented. Yep. What are some other genres? Historical, yep. Yep, what else? Poetry, yep. Prophetic. Yep. Wisdom.
Musical.
Sorry, what?
Music.
Music, yeah. Because the Psalms are basically that, right? And it's kind of like poetry, but yeah. Yeah. And then you could do maybe law and letters would be maybe some other ones, right? So all of these different things now, different genres are read a little bit differently. So for example, when I read in the law or a letter, do not lie to one another, what does that mean? It's a command, and you take it very literally, right? It means do not lie. It's that simple, right? Which is why I think we sometimes especially are drawn to letters, because they're a lot easier to read in that sense, right? If you're reading poetry, it gets a little bit trickier, right? Like, what does it mean when it talks about, say in, I'm trying to remember which psalm it is, but like, as deep calls out to deep and as waters overflow, right? It's like, it's this imagery, right? And imagery, you're kind of meant to think about it and kind of make connections, right? And those connections are easier or harder to make when you're more familiar with the imagery, right? So for example, if I said to you, man, that came out of left field, do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, right? It's from baseball, it's way out there, right? Or if I said, hey man, I threw you a real curveball, you would know like it's something unexpected, right? Change of direction. But imagine if you wrote that down and 1,000 years from now, someone who knew nothing about baseball read that, right? It'd be a lot harder, right? They'd have to try to understand a little bit about baseball and what curveballs are and how that analogy is used to make sense, right? So sometimes when we read some different genres, we're going to need to try to learn a bit about some of the context to make more sense of it, right? And one of the things I always want to mention up front is that these genres, they're all communicating truth, right? But they all communicate truth in slightly different ways, right? So it's not that any of these genres are less or more truthful. It's just they communicate truth differently. So the Lord is my shepherd is true, but that's not literally true in the sense of we're not literally sheep. But it communicates truth in a beautiful way through a symbol, right? So sometimes some people will try to say, well, if it's symbolic, it means it's less true. That's not true. Symbols are just a different way of communicating truth, right? Now, it's always helpful when you first start a book to just try to think about, well, what genre is this? So that you go into it kind of aware of some of the things you should be paying attention to. So let's think about the book of Genesis. What genre is the book of Genesis here? Historical. Yep. Historical. Yep. And then I'll add this little tag to it, historical narrative. All right? So it's historical, which means that it's recording events that really happened, right? They're true. I think what's also helpful us to remember, though, is that they didn't record history back then the same way we do now, right? So we have tape recorders, we have video cameras, so we expect a very, very high level of precision and accuracy, right? But they didn't have that back then. So for example, when they're recording speeches from people, that might not have been exactly what they said word for word, but they're capturing the essence of what they said, right? So a great analogy just to help us see how this isn't kind of concerning is, if you were to go home and talk to a friend about, what we were talking about this morning, you might use slightly different words than someone else in this room. But you're still both going to be talking about the same thing, right? So when we talk about history, it's true, but we need to recognize, okay, we need to think about it as history from an ancient perspective and how they told history. They had different rules. They didn't always worry about chronology the way they did. They might skip around in the story because they want to connect ideas or different things like that, all right? So we're just going to want to keep that in mind. Let's not impose our standard of history, but let's not minimize or say it's not history. It is history. It's true events, all right? But it's told as a narrative, all right? And what that means is it's told in the form of basic conventions of storytelling. Not that it's false, it's just it's told in the convention of a narrative. So let's think about that for a minute. What things go into a story? What elements does a writer use when they're telling a story? Characters, yes. So we're going to have a lot of focus on characters here, right? Now, here's something really important, and this is worth jotting down. Just because a character does something in the Bible does not mean God approves of it. Right? I think it's just good to say that up front, okay? Just because the Bible is inerrant, it's fully true, God's inspired it, doesn't mean that what the characters did was good or inspired by God. It just means it's recording what actually happened and how God still works through it, okay? But just because the character does it doesn't mean it's good, right? Characters can also lie. Just because a character says something or says something about God does not mean that that's actually true either. The only voice we can always trust is the narrator, all right? So, and this helps us avoid contradictions, for example. So a great example is at the end of Samuel, we read, at the end of 1 Samuel, we read that Saul, when he's being pursued, falls on his own sword because the armor bearer wouldn't kill him. And then in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, a Amalekite comes to David and says, David, I saw Saul in the battle and he asked me to run him through, so I did. And you could look at that and say, well, that's a contradiction, but it's not. Probably he found Saul dead, and he's thinking, oh, I know that Saul was against David. I'll win some brownie points with David by saying I was the guy that struck down Saul. He's lying. But David says, well, by your own mouth you're condemned, and he gets executed. Far from getting brownie points, he gets executed because David had more respect for God's chosen king than that guy did, right? But again, there's a great example of where characters aren't always telling the truth, okay? The other thing we need to remember when we think about characters is in the Bible, there's always one character involved in every single story, even if he's operating more behind the scenes. Can you guess who that is? Seeing some nods? God, right? We need to keep paying attention to what God is always doing in the stories, okay? We're going to miss something if we leave out God. All right, so that's characters. What else do we have in, what other elements do we have in a story?
The arc of the story or the storyline.
Yeah, yep. Oftentimes I'll call it the plot, but I'll just put /story. Yeah, right? So a story has movement, right? Problems emerge, people deal with those problems, the problems are solved, right? So we want to pay attention to the flow of kind of the story, right?
Like drama?
Yeah, like a drama. Yep, exactly. In fact, I heard one Old Testament scholar once say we'd probably be better Bible readers if we read the Bible like we read a mystery book. And he wasn't saying it's fiction. What he was pointing out is when you read a mystery book, you're reading along, you go, that's interesting. That character pops in here. I wonder if they're actually important. Maybe they'll pop up again. And you pay attention to those things, right? We should be doing the same thing when we're reading. The Bible is saying, I wonder why that happened. You know, it seems like a side thing right now, but I wonder if that'll be important later in the story. And we're paying attention to this development, this arc of the story, right? What else do we have in the elements of a narrative?
You could potentially have tension.
Tension, yep. Yep, that kind of falls under kind of plot, this idea of tension, conflict, yep. Yep. So stories have characters, they have, so to speak, action. They also need a place or a setting. This is something we often fly by in our Bibles. Oops, I'm throwing my marker around. But places have significance, right? So if I say the White House, what does that conjure in your mind? Probably a very specific image, right? It's not just any White House, but it conveys our nation's Capitol building, right? Where the president lives, right? There are certain places that matter, and it's the same in the Old Testament, right? There are places that matter, and they pop up again. And so it's worth us paying attention to what are these places that pop up again. So for example, say you're reading in John chapter 4, and you're reading about Jesus, and he goes to Jacob's well. Well, what's Jacob's well? Why did John bother telling us it's Jacob's well? Well, what happened at Jacob's well? If you were to go back to Genesis, you're like, oh, that's the well that Jacob dug where he met Rachel, right? And then you start to think about, well, what else happens at wells? Well, in the Old Testament, pretty much whenever a Jewish guy goes to a well, he meets his wife, right? So just by putting that detail in, John has gotten us to be thinking about a Jewish man finding his wife at the well. And here's Jesus, a Jewish man at a well, except he doesn't meet Rachel or Rebecca, right? These mothers of the faith. He meets a Samaritan woman who's been married 5 times and is with another man. And yet, effectively, Jesus invites her into a relationship with him. And that's beautiful. And what do you know? If we're paying attention to context, the last story before jumping that story is where John says, I'm the friend of the bridegroom. And so you already have this idea of weddings in our minds if we're reading John's gospel. And John wants to show us how different Jesus is, where he doesn't just come for the good Jewish girl, but he comes for anyone and everyone. And it's there because that place makes you think about something, right? Or that's what the author wants you to be doing. Now, sometimes we just breeze past it, but he wants us to make those connections. So we want to pay attention to places, all right, when kind of we're reading story, all right? So as we read through Genesis, we want to be really paying attention to characters. We want to be paying attention to plot. We want to be paying attention to place, okay? So our genre of historical narrative has given us some clues as to what we need to pay attention to start. So now let's talk about a second principle here, the idea of context. Because if it's a narrative, if it's a story, and it's got plot that's moving someplace, okay? Have any of you ever walked in like halfway through a movie? Maybe it's like a family member or friend's watching something and you walk in halfway through. It's very disorienting, isn't it, right? You walk in, you're like, you don't know who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, what the problem is, right? And then, you ask all these questions and then your friend gets mad at you because you're like, stop interrupting me, just watch the movie and you'll figure it out, right? But actually, the best thing to do is just start from the beginning and watch it all the way through, right? Because when you jump in halfway through a story, you don't have context for what's going on. So that's why this principle here is, it's this image of a TV screen, and then you've got these boxes that represent the different scenes. And if you jump in at scene 2 out of 3 scenes, it's going to be really hard to know what's going on. And so if you do jump in at scene 2, and when you're reading your Bible, that's okay, but we just need to say, okay, well then what happened before? Well, what happens afterwards, right? Because that's going to help us understand what's going on in scene 2, right? So we need to be aware of kind of the context. We need to try to see the whole story and how this one part fits in order to make sense of it. So that's something we're going to want to do a lot today as we're reading Genesis, is every time we're zooming in one passage, we want to be asking, well, what came before? How does this part pick up on that part? How does this set up what's coming next? Right? We want to keep that in mind. It's going to help us interpret Genesis better. Right? The other type of context we want to pay attention to is historical context. Right? So as much as we can, trying to be aware of what was life like back then, or what things do I need to understand about life back then to make sense of the story. Some of this we can do just from reading the Bible and kind of seeing other parts of the Bible to help us interpret this section. Sometimes this is where it is helpful to go to like a commentary or study Bible, because there might be something that just we're not really aware of, it doesn't make any sense to us. That's probably a good indication that, hey, maybe there's something else going on here, and I need to go get a little bit of help from people that have read all the things, because there's all kinds of documents out there of like what the Egyptians believed at the same time period, what the Ugaritic Empire believed at the same time, what the Assyrians believed, and all of that's in the background to what's going on in kind of the Bible. Because what's really helpful to remember is the story of Genesis was not written for us in the 21st century. So, yep.
Historical narratives are both true.
Yep.
The truth in it, or we can always say that if it's historical, it's true.
Yes.
But I don't know if that is correct or not.
No, I do think that if it's in the Bible, right, it's true.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
But in a general historical narrative
Oh, yeah.
document.
Right, yeah, that's true. You're right. You're right. If we're reading, say, a Egyptian story of what happened, what they say happened in the beginning, that's not necessarily true, right? Yeah.
Even historical book in school.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Yeah.
I never took one. I never went to high school here, but I heard that a lot of historical books are not really correct.
Yeah, right. Well, when we're reading people's takes on history, we got to, if you're willing to dig into it, you can look at the primary sources and see, like, are they interpreting that well? Are they putting their own slant on it? Are they leaving things out, right? So you're right. We need to be careful of those things.
On Genesis, when we say historical, we have to be aware that historical doesn't mean it's scientific.
Right, yes.
Genesis is not a scientific book
Yes.
in that sense.
Yep. Yeah, and so for example, like, Genesis has things to speak to our current time period, but it wasn't written directly to us. So think about Genesis as this is the story that God gave to his people to say, this is what the world's really like. This is what I'm really like. Don't believe all the other things out there. Well, the other things out there for them were not Darwinian evolution. So it's not primarily targeting that. It's targeting the worldview that they were encountering and saying, that's false, here's the true story. Now, that's going to have implications for us today as well, but we got to keep in mind that it's contrasting the old myths and not our current myths, right? So that's really important to kind of understand. So that's something we're going to want to keep in mind as we kind of go through Genesis, right? This is rejecting the myths and beliefs of the other peoples of that time period and saying this is the true story. Again, that's still true for us. It's still going to be true for us today. It's going to have implications for us today. But you're right, it's not written as a science textbook. In fact, there's a lot of things that Genesis doesn't explain, that leaves out, right? Because it's not interested in telling us everything, the Bible's interested in telling us what we need to know as God's determined it. I tell this to my kids all the time. We'll be reading something in the Bible, and they're like, what about this? I'm like, I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. But he's told us enough to know what we need to know, to trust him and to live for him, right? And so that's what we want to pay attention to, right? So here's what I want us to do to start is, as we jump into the book of Genesis, I want us to try to get our heads around the whole book together so we can see what's kind of the outline of the whole story so that we can see, so to speak, the whole plot and then kind of jump into then working through these first chapters, all right? So how do you do that? How do you try to get your head around a big book like Genesis, right? How do you try to find the literary context of the whole book? Well, one thing you can do is look at the beginning and you can look at the end of a book. So for example, at the very beginning of Genesis, let me erase some things here so I have space for this. All right, at the very beginning of Genesis, everything is good. All right, that's Genesis 1. That's one of the most repeated words. Everything is good, good, good. At the very end of Genesis, one of the very last speeches is Joseph saying, well, you planned for evil, but God plans good. All right, so I'll put human evil, but God plans good. That's how Joseph sums up his life. Well, you planned for evil, and God has planned for good. And that's kind of where the book of Genesis ends. So you have the starting, everything's good, and at the end, we see that God is still at work doing good, but now we have this element of human evil, right? How do we get from here to here, and what's God been doing in the middle? That's what we want to take a look at. So when you're looking at a big book, one of the things that's helpful to do is to kind of break it up into chunks or sections, okay? And so you're going to look for transitions, right? And those transitions might be, let's think about narrative, focusing on a new character. You could break down a book by which sections focus on certain characters, right? Because that's how a narrative often works. We're going to follow one character for a bit, and we're going to switch to follow a different character. You could also maybe try to break it up by looking at places. Is there an emphasis on which places that God is working in? Or sometimes there's other unique features in that book that help us kind of pay attention to how the author wants to give us a clue to breaking up the book. Now in Genesis, I'll just give you a heads up, there is actually just that thing. So for example, if you look at Genesis chapter 2 with me, verse 4, we read these words, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth." Now that phrase, "these are the generations of," shows up again and again and again and again in Genesis. And by tracing that phrase, we'll see how the author is kind of like giving us almost like chapter divisions with that phrase. So here's what I want you to do. I want you guys in your groups to kind of skim through the book of Genesis and try to find all the spots where that phrase, "these are the generations of," shows up. All right? And so mark that down, kind of what the verse number is and what it says the generations are of. Okay? And then we'll come back together in a bit and we'll put that up together and we'll see if that can help us see kind of an outline of what God's doing in the book of Genesis. Okay? Does that make sense? So you're going to look for that phrase, "these are the generations of," and mark down kind of where that is, and then we'll come back together and talk about it. I'm going to give you guys